I'm going to be talking to Marla Orenstein, who's the research director for the Canada West Foundation, about a new study around ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And the approach here is to try to give investors, some guidelines on how to invest in climate friendly and sustainable businesses. So welcome to the interview, Marla.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Now, ESG has been a contentious issue in the natural resource industries, particularly oil and gas, for a while. What's the take from, give us an overview of your study, please.
Sure. Well, ESG, it's been hard to miss this acronym. It shows up every place. And we're not actually taking a stand on whether ESG is good or bad, how it could be changed, et cetera. What we were doing in the study is we noticed a giant hole. There is a ton of information about ESG that's coming out every day. It litters my inbox. But essentially, it's been targeted to two audiences, either companies that need to disclose their ESG metrics, how to do that, why they should, how they should. Or it's been information that's been targeted to investors saying, if you're interested in using ESG as part of your investment criteria, here's what to be looking for, and here's how that's changing. What nobody has been talking about, and where our report goes, is what should government be doing? Should government be paying attention to this? Is it relevant to what they do as government? And what are the options that they have for moving forward? So that was the sweet spot that we tried to land in, is producing something that will help governments work through some of these issues.
What were some of the recommendations that you provided to government in your study?
There's a lot of work that's being done already by various levels of government on things like defining what a green or a transition instrument is, or on mandating climate disclosure. We let them know about all the different things that are happening, just to be able to place it in context. But then we also identified a couple of different things that we thought they should be doing, and a couple that they absolutely shouldn't. Some of the easy pickings really, and that we say you should be doing, have to do with data. Governments produce a ton of data. They put it out in the public domain. Sometimes it's hard to find. Sometimes its relevance to ESG is difficult to identify. But if they can look at how they're putting out data and package it a little bit differently and promote it a little bit differently, then it will help those ESG interested audiences to better identify how the jurisdiction is doing and how companies in the jurisdiction are doing. So without taking a stand one way or the other, it's a very easy step that governments can be taking to do to package things and to promote things. Similarly, there's a huge burden on companies that want to put out their ESG information. I read a stat from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States that said to prepare climate disclosures was going to cost companies about $500,000 US per year. So what's an advantage is if compliance data can be aligned with how ESG reporting needs to be done, so that you can figure out your numbers once and use them for a number of different things instead of having to figure out a whole bunch of different things. It saves time and it saves cost for companies. So those are two actions that we would recommend that governments take to make things better. I have a big don't. Do you want to hear the big don't?
Please.
It seems like when governments are sitting down to say, what can we do? One of the first things that comes to mind for them is, let's create our own ESG framework. They look at the standard ESG frameworks and say, it doesn't really work for our local context, which is very true most of the time because these things are intended to be global and universal. And they say, well, let's make our own Province X framework and companies can report to that. That's a mistake. The investor world globally does not care about your own Province X framework for companies to report. It just creates another layer on top of the 600 frameworks that already exist for what companies have to report to. So we think that is not a fruitful path for governments to go down, and we strongly recommend that they do not do that.
I have a question for you because there's an Alberta specific approach to this. That's, it's talked about. Premier Jason Kenney addresses this all the time. You see it from oil company CEOs, and that is right now a lot of the emphasis in ESG is in the E, and the E is defined primarily as climate, which is, the Alberta oil sands doesn't score well on GHG emissions. So they keep trying to shift the emphasis of, but no, look at the way what we do in social. look at how well we're governed. Look at our governance structures, which of course investors put weight somewhat less in today's context. How should governments be handling that particular issue?
Well, you're absolutely right that there's been an overly relatively heavy focus on the E and specifically on the emissions. It's not just a question of battling narratives, though. I heard somebody say yesterday, the problem isn't just emissions, it's been our relationships with the natural world writ large. We need to fix all those things. And the social and governance is important as well. We probably do relatively well in Canada and Alberta, but frankly, there's not a lot of hard numbers that really back this up. Doing this ESG work and benchmarking is going to be able to help demonstrate that, absolutely. And the Alberta government has taken what they're calling a jurisdictional ESG approach. It's very forward thinking. They're one of the first governments that I have seen worldwide that has decided to benchmark its own performance as a jurisdiction. And the process that they went through is they went and looked at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and basically identified which are the ones that are really relevant in Alberta context, and have created a framework that they say these are the, I think it's 16 different elements that we think are the most important for us to understand how well we're doing as a province and to improve in the future. And they're still relatively early in the stages of this. They've identified what those are, but they haven't done any benchmarking yet or looking to how to ratchet those up. But having an honest, hard look about where we are right now and making commitments about where we will improve in the future across all those different domains is something that I think will have a lot of weight with investors, because it's a really honest look at things as opposed to just trying to be a booster and promote your narrative, which doesn't feel very authentic to a lot of people.
The first thing that leapt into my head when you describe what the Alberta government is doing, it sounds like it contradicts your earlier advice for them not to develop their own, metrics.
No, there's a really important difference between the two. The Alberta government is developing a framework to report on its own performance. How do we as a jurisdiction do in terms of water management? How do we as a jurisdiction do in terms of, oh gosh, I'm making up occupational health and safety. I don't actually know that it's on their list, but those things could be out there. What they shouldn't be doing and what nobody should be doing is handing a framework to companies saying, in your disclosure report, these are the metrics that you have to report on, because that creates the duplication. So there is that big difference between looking and saying, how do we grade ourselves, or how do we benchmark ourselves as a jurisdiction versus here's what goes in your report, companies.
Gotcha. Marla, always fascinating. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.